Yeah. Hello, everybody. We're just waiting to make sure that everybody's in before we get started. Nice big crowd tonight.
Welcome, everyone.
Okay, Grace, why don't you go ahead and start?
Thank you, Ed. Hello, everyone, and welcome to University Bookstore's virtual author event series, an hour of great discussion in celebration of wonderful authors and books. My name is Grace, and I'm the events producer here at University Bookstore in Seattle, Washington. I'm joined behind the scenes by my fellow bookseller, Ed, who will be handling all of the tech for us today. We would love to hear where you're all zooming in from, so please let us know in the chat. Before we start, on behalf of University Bookstore, the oldest independent bookstore in the region, and celebrating our 121st anniversary this year, I would like to thank you all for supporting an independent bookstore today, and for all your support during the pandemic. With your help, we were able to weather a year that has been incredibly difficult for all small businesses, and we are extremely grateful. Thank you for joining us for a discussion of Daniel James Brown's latest book, Facing the Mountain, a true story of Japanese American heroes in World War II. Facing the Mountain is an unforgettable chronicle of wartime America and the battlefields of Europe. Based on Daniel's extensive interviews with the families of the protagonists, as well as deep archival research, it portrays the kaleidoscopic journey of 4 Japanese American families and their sons, who volunteered for the 442nd Regimental Combat Team and were deployed to France, Germany, and Italy, where they were asked to do the near impossible. Dan will be joined in conversation by Tom Ikeda, founding executive director of Densho, and will have opening remarks and moderated questions at the end by Paul Rucker, executive director of the University of Washington Alumni Association. Dan and Tom will do their presentation first, followed by some questions by Paul. Following that, he will also moderate the audience Q&A. So if you think of questions anytime during this discussion, please add them to the Q&A field at the bottom of your Zoom screens. We have signed copies of Facing the Mountain available at University Bookstore, and we'll put the link to that in our chat periodically if you wish to purchase a copy. A few words about today's panelists before we start. Their full bios will be accessible in the link to our events page in your chat field. Daniel James Brown is the author of The Indifferent Stars Above and Under a Flaming Sky, as well as The Boys in the Boat, about the University of Washington's championship crew team at the 1936 Berlin Olympics. And as you can imagine, that is a nonstop bestseller at our store. He has taught writing at San Jose State University and Stanford University and lives outside Seattle. Tom Ikeda is the founding executive director of Densho, a grassroots organization dedicated to preserving, educating, and sharing the story of World War II era incarceration of Japanese Americans in order to deepen understandings of American history and inspire action for equity. In addition to leading the organization over the last 24 years, Tom has conducted more than 250 video recorded oral history interviews with Japanese Americans and has written the foreword to Facing the Mountain. Paul Rucker, as Vice President for Alumni and Stakeholder Engagement, serves as Executive Director of the University of Washington Alumni Association, a 130-year-old nonprofit organization committed to advancing higher education in the state of Washington and supporting the UW. Paul is a member of the UW President's Cabinet and the executive team for University Advancement, which leads all institutional engagement, marketing and communications, and philanthropic programs and services. I know we have quite a few alumni tuning in, so in the chat, please feel free to let your other grads know what graduating year you're in. And now I will turn things over to Paul to say a few words of welcome and then hand it off to Dan and Tom.
Grace, thank you. What a wonderful opportunity to be with everybody tonight. And just on behalf of the University of Washington and the Alumni Association, recognizing the extraordinary university bookstore, having one of the region's foremost independent bookstores right here, nestled into the University District in the University of Washington community is just incredible. I just have a few brief reflections, and I want to acknowledge that the University of Washington resides on the lands of the Coast Salish nations, here in the shared waters of the Suquamish, Duwamish, Tulalip, and Muckleshoot tribes. As we think about land acknowledgement and what it means to be on Indigenous land, so many of the themes that are so timeless in our society, and certainly themes that Dan and Tom will be discussing later in Dan's new book, resonate with us certainly today. I have to say that having an opportunity to be back with Daniel James Brown and think about the power of narrative and the power of storytelling is really compelling. In 2013, I first met Dan at a book signing. He was there with Judy Willman, Joe Rance's daughter, of course, the main character from The Boys in the Boat. And I knew that something special was occurring. As Judy and Dan were there and they were talking, they were together. There was an attentiveness, a connection, a commitment that Dan had and made to engaging the personal stories and the impact of the experiences of those incredible rowers in the 1936 crew. In the subsequent years, as The Boys in the Boat rose to fame and Dan Brown was traversing across the country, he spent time at the university, time with our Alumni Association, time at our events and programs, talking about the impact of public education, the role that the University of Washington had in our community, and the way that the community supported these rowers and the University of Washington. I think of Tom Ikeda's work with Densho and the power of story, and how Tom's work throughout these years to memorialize and capture the incredible narrative of impact and the experiences of our Japanese American community during these very turbulent years. We gather now today, Tom and Dan's latest book, chronicling the stories of these incredible individuals, and again, the community that came together in unique and creative ways. The University of Washington has been around for 150 years. The power of education, the opportunity to see that the collective gain that we have as a community occurs when we invest with each other. Higher education, all of the ways that this community comes together to support public education, the role of the university, and the role of the University of Washington as this story unfolds in the credible tale, of course, of Gordon Hirabayashi. So this university and this community, the work of organizations like Densho, the University Bookstore, the Alumni Association, our collective gain, the investment that we make in each other to memorialize, to capture, and to advance our collective values is just so prominent and so resonant today. So on behalf of the university, the Alumni Association, and our incredible bookstore, it's really exciting to be here today with Dan and Tom. I look forward to our conversation and being with you again shortly. I'll turn it over now, Daniel James Brown and Tom Ikeda.
Wow, Paul, what a great introduction. And Grace, thank you too. And Dan, I mean, what we're going to do is we're going to just have a conversation. And it's fun because it's a university bookstore. And so we can make this more, I think, Seattle-centric and the University of Washington. And I want to just start to mention to the other Huskies out there, I have 3 degrees from the University of Washington, chemistry, chemical engineering, and business. And so it's, I wish we could do this in person because it'd be great to go back and visit my old haunts. But Dan, I'm going to start and talk a little bit about the making of the book, and in particular, bringing the kind of Seattle connection by talking about how we met 5.5 years ago. It was on the grounds of the Seattle Center. And you were there receiving an award for The Boys in the Boat. I had read the book probably about a year before, and was a big fan. As a Husky, I grew up watching the crew team, and I was there to share Densho and getting an award from the mayor also for work at Densho. But I remember distinctly we were both on the stage sitting there, and I think the mayor was talking, and we just started kind of chatting back and forth, and And I was talking about a little bit about Japanese American history. And it really surprised me when you said, oh, you know what, you're interested in Japanese American history. You're genuinely interested. So that was exciting. I wondered, can you talk about what happened next?
Yeah, so I was so interested in what you were saying on stage that day. I went home and I'm pretty sure it was that night I logged in and I started to view this incredible collection of oral histories that you have made available on the Densho website. And I spent the next several days basically just sitting and watching and listening to these firsthand accounts of Japanese Americans living through the World War II experience. And I was just mesmerized by some of the stories I was hearing. I mean, I'm always drawn to good stories. Stories are sort of what I'm all about. And these were the kinds of stories that many of them were the kinds of stories that naturally attract me. They were about people talking when they were younger, about overcoming very difficult circumstances, really ordinary Americans, in this case, all Japanese Americans, going about their lives and then suddenly having to deal with enormous challenges in their lives and getting through those challenges through resilience and perseverance and sheer force of will, and a lot of the same values and attributes really that were in the Boys in the Boat story. So the stories really resonated with me, and as you know, then I began to engage in a conversation with you about there was so much there. I was really having a hard time getting my head around how I might actually take some of this and turn it
So
into a
let
book.
me talk about that, Lou, because you're such a humble guy. So we've known each other for 5.5 years, and we have talked a lot. And at Densho, so I've been doing this for 25 years, and we have about 1,000 oral histories, hundreds of thousands of documents and photographs. And so I've talked with over 100 authors, filmmakers, podcasters, educators who come to our website, our archive, and use these materials. And you were special. It's kind of interesting. You talk about how you just love story, and when people read the book, if they haven't yet, they'll understand this because you tell the story in such a deep, authentic, historically accurate way, but with such sensitivity. And what I've come to realize is you can't do that unless you are that yourself. And over the years, the time we've spent together, sharing stories back and forth. And I remember at the beginning, you were trying to find like one family story that could tell the whole story. I said, well, probably need to do about 12, and we went back and forth. But it's been a really enjoyable experience. And the question I remember after about a year or two into it, thinking, okay, so here's going to be the interesting part for you because the story is so big, so complex. How are you going to tell the story in one book? And so talk about that. How did you narrow it down?
Right. So yeah, that was the big challenge. And what I finally settled on was I realized that young Nisei men, Japanese, second generation Japanese American men, young men of draft age, faced a particular dilemma immediately after Pearl Harbor. Their classmates in their high schools, their friends were signing up by the millions, literally, to enlist in the American military and fight overseas. At the same time, they and their families were being called away out of their homes and incarcerated in these concentration camps all through the American West. And so many of them didn't really want to serve that government. So there was this real dilemma that everybody faced in the wake of Pearl Harbor, of course, but young Japanese American men faced a particular dilemma. And so I decided to focus the book on a few of those, what were then young men, and tell their stories. So that sort of became the mechanism of finding a focus. But then I also wanted, one of the reasons I think that The Boys in the Boat has resonated so well with readers is that people just like the characters in that book. They are earnest, engaging, intelligent, sometimes mischievous young men that people can relate to. So I also wanted to find characters that I thought were really interesting, that were likable, and also that broke some stereotypes, because I felt that part of what I wanted to do was smash some stereotypes. So, that was sort of the screening process that I was using to narrow down to the 4 that I eventually settled on.
Great. So we're going to talk about the 4, but I want to back up just a little bit, because you used a term that I use and I'm comfortable with, the term concentration camp. And I realize when I go out and speak, sometimes you want to provide some context so people understand that we're in no way trying to compare what happened to Japanese Americans, which at the time the FDR administration called them concentration camps. They were American concentration camps. And to distinguish that from the death camps that were happening in Germany. I just wanted to mention that for the audience.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, in fact, it wasn't just that one term. The government wrapped the whole experience of incarcerating all these people. They wrapped the whole thing in very euphemistic language. The assembly centers is what they called these fairgrounds and horse stalls, where people were made to live before they went to the permanent camps, which they called relocation centers, and they called it an evacuation instead of a forced removal. So there was a lot of euphemistic language surrounding what the government did. And I just thought it was important to use honest terms, but absolutely not equating what happened here to places like Dachau and Auschwitz.
Yeah, great. And so let's talk about the 4 men, and we're going to start with a University of Washington grad, Gordon Hirabayashi. And here's a picture of Gordon. After the war had started, and he's it's his wedding picture with Esther Schmo. People who are into University of Washington history might recognize Schmo because Floyd Schmo was Esther's father, and at one point he was, I believe, a professor at the University of Washington. And so this is a photograph. But Dan, when you see this picture, talk about Gordon.
Yeah, Gordon was such an interesting guy. He was, of course, a University of Washington student, and one of the first things that happened in the aftermath of Pearl Harbor was that a curfew, an 8 p.m. curfew, was imposed on anybody of Japanese ancestry living in Seattle. Gordon was a young man of very strong principles. He was a Quaker and a conscientious objector even before the war began. And he felt that this curfew violated his fundamental constitutional rights. So he began to deliberately disobey that curfew and stay out beyond the time that was allocated. And that was typical for Gordon. He later, when the time came for Japanese Americans to be taken out of their homes and incarcerated, he just didn't get on the bus. Instead, he went down to the FBI office in Seattle and turned himself in.
Yeah, so we're going to show a clip of Gordon. And, again, for UW grads, Gordon, this clip is when he's talking about being in Suzzallo Library, the main library on campus. And he's with other classmates who were white. And at this point, there was a curfew, an 8 p.m. curfew, assigned to Japanese Americans, people of Japanese ancestry. No one else but just Japanese Americans. And Gordon, it's like 5 minutes to 8, and this is Gordon talking about what happened next.
And then one day, I'm dashing home with, "Hey, Gordon, it's 5 to 8. I grab my stuff, and it takes about 5 minutes to get home. So I'm just dashing home, and it hit me. A question that I should have faced earlier, it just hit me. How come I'm dashing home and all your timekeepers are still there? It just needed the question to be raised. I knew I couldn't answer it, without saying I can't do it. I turned around and went back to the library. Hey, what's the matter? And I said, well, you guys are here. We got work to do. I said, I got work to do too. I decided if you guys are here, I'm gonna work with you. I'll go back when you guys are ready to go. Nobody turned me in. And I didn't take that until it hit me. And when it hit me, I knew, gosh, I can't do it. That's two-faced.
Yeah, I love that clip. Yeah, I should mention, I didn't mention this earlier. So that is an oral history that Densho did about 21 years ago. I conducted 5 interviews with Gordon right about the time he was receiving, I believe the honor was the Distinguished Alumni Award at the University of Washington in the year 2000. But Dan, what do you see when you saw that clip?
Yeah, so as I say, that he was a man of such strong principles. Principles were everything to him, and he was extraordinarily brave. We're going to talk about some other guys in a minute who displayed incredible bravery on the battlefield. But to me, Gordon is just a different face of courage. It's an incredible thing for a man as young as him to defy the government the way he did. I mentioned before that when the time came for Japanese Americans in Seattle to be sent away to camps, he turned himself in. He took with him a statement that he wrote outlining why he thought that the incarcerations and the curfews were both wrong and illegal and unconstitutional. And when he went down to the FBI office to turn himself in, he handed that statement to them because he really believed that it was on solid constitutional grounds. It seemed clear to him, as it would to most of us today, that both of those things were unconstitutional. But he wound up spending the war years in and out of jails, first the King County Jail, and then a work farm in Arizona, and then finally a federal prison in Washington State, as he fought his case all the way up to the Supreme Court.
Yeah, no, it's a great story. There's lots of materials, special collections at the University of Washington. I mean, they have a lot of materials around Gordon. If anyone's really interested, they have perhaps, the best collection of information about Gordon. So that's Gordon, one of 4. The other 3 men, we're going to, they exhibit a different type of courage. The next 3 men were all members of the 442nd Regimental Combat Team. This was a segregated infantry unit during World War II of Japanese American infantry soldiers. And the next one we're going to talk about, and let me show his photograph, is Katsugo Miho. Katz Miho, Katz was his nickname, from Hawaii. So talk about Katz Miho and his role in the story.
Yeah, Katz grew up on Maui at a time when Maui and most of the Hawaiian Islands were basically run as on the plantation system, sugarcane and pineapple plantations. That was, of course, a very racially stratified system, very brutal working conditions. But Katz grew up on Maui with a family actually that ran a small family hotel on that island. He was a student at the University of Hawaii when Pearl Harbor happened. In fact, he witnessed the attack on Pearl Harbor from the roof of his residence hall. And because he was enrolled in the university, he was a member of the ROTC, the Reserve Officer Training Corps. When he saw the bombing happen, the radio came on and it told him that young ROTC men were supposed to assemble on the campus. So he ran across the street to the campus and there joined several hundred other young men, most of them Japanese American, milling around in an auditorium. They were issued uniforms. They were handed old 1905 vintage rifles that they didn't know how to shoot. And they were told that they were now part of something called the Hawaii Territorial Guard. And so, people expected that an invasion of Hawaii was imminent after the attack on Pearl Harbor. So they sent all these young men down to the waterfront in Honolulu. And for the next several nights, actually several weeks, Katz and these other young men patrolled the waterfront in Honolulu, ready to do whatever they could do to repel a Japanese invasion.
And so, I brought up this clip, right when you're talking about, they were the Hawaii Territorial Guard, and here Katsumiho, talks about his time there, and then a dramatic scene at the end, which I'll have you talk about after he does this.
Our group of University of Hawaii students were dropped off as guards over area in the dark on 4-hour shifts, and for 2-3 nights in a row we were serving as, I don't know what we would have done, because we were given a loaded rifle. We were given a loaded rifle with 5 rounds of ammunition. We didn't even know how to fire the gun. But we were given this rifle. We were told, you load it this way, and this is the way how you lock it in case anything happens. To this day, I wonder, what was if anything happened was what they were referring to, because not that nothing happened, but what if anything had happened, what were we supposed to do, because we were not giving any kind of orders. A month and a half later, early in the morning, we got called up and said, hey, we're going to report down to Lanakila Intermediate School. And we woke up at about 2 o'clock in the morning. They woke us up at 2 o'clock. And then finally, about 5:30, a truck came by to pick us up. We were all fully packed and everything. We dropped us off at Lanakila. We wondered what was going on. We found out that the whole battalion was assembled at Lanakila. And then Major Frazier, who was the acting commander of the battalion, came up and told us point blank, right straight in our face, he says, the reason why you are here this morning is because all you Americans of Japanese ancestry, I'm pretty sure he referred to it, Americans of Japanese ancestry, because of your ethnic background, you are being discharged herein right off the bat, right as of now, you are being discharged from the Hawaiian territory. Only the AJAs. And completely stayed shocked.
Yeah, Katz is such a good storyteller. I was just watching that clip and how he draws you in some cases with humor. We talked about the absurdity of 5 rounds of ammunition, and what would they do when if they were attacked? But then ending with that kind of that moment at the end. Talk about that.
Yeah, so that moment was an enormous shock. Actually, a lot of the young men that were there in the pre-dawn darkness that day were actually, Katz could hear them crying in the darkness around them. They were so devastated. They had been like other young American men. They'd been in uniform, serving, helping to protect the country. And then all of a sudden, they're told, no, actually, you can't do that because your ancestry is Japanese. And so devastated, Katz went back to Maui and got a job on Maui. And it was another year yet before the 442nd was created and he was finally allowed to enlist.
We've been talking about 4 men and how you focus on this, but I think this might be a good moment to mention the book's much more than these 4 men, and you talked a lot about families and other members. Women were in the story. Talk about that in relationship to Katsumiho and his family.
Yeah, so very much, I mean, it's very important, I think, to understand that in this book, I really wanted, although it was focused on these 4 young men, I really wanted readers to understand that they lived their lives in the context, as we all do, of families who loved them. And so I wanted to talk about their parents' immigrant experience, in particular, the Issei when they first came either to Hawaii or to the mainland of the United States, and then their siblings and the people that were close to them. Katz, for instance, had a sister named Fumie, and she had actually left Hawaii. She was disgusted by the racial hierarchy in Hawaii and the plantation system. So she moved to to Japan, hoping that she'd be accepted there just before the war broke out. And she actually discovered that life in Japan was very difficult, especially for somebody who'd been born in the United States. And as the war went on, it got more and more difficult, of course, and it's particularly as Japan began to lose the war. So I built her story in, and then it's interesting. We see her at the very end of the book, or near the end of the book. After the fire bombings of Tokyo, her family moved to a village outside of Hiroshima. And Fumie had a job in downtown Hiroshima, but she missed her train into the city that morning. So she was still at the train station when the atomic bomb was dropped. But she was close enough that she could see the mushroom cloud. And a few hours later, trains came back into her village with people who were terribly burned. And so Fumie the next day made her way into what was left of central Hiroshima, trying to find a work friend. And she never found her. Instead, she spent days wandering around in the ruins of Hiroshima, trying to tend to and help the people, the survivors. And it utterly changed her life. She became a Quaker and a very ardent activist for peace, and spent the rest of her life traveling the world and advocating for peace. So she's a really interesting character in and of herself.
You know, one of the things I love about the book and you, Dan, is the authenticity of the story. I mean, I had this conversation with my daughter. She's a filmmaker and she is a storyteller. Because of the research you did, the stories you unearthed and told are in many ways, I told my daughter, better than fiction. I mean, they are such powerful stories that you brought to life. And so let's move on and come back to the mainland and go to California. And the next person we're going to talk about is Irudi Tokiwa. And here's a picture of Rudy, when he's fighting in Europe, and he's the gentleman in front, or young man. And the other thing that your book really captures are the personalities. And we both kind of, smile and laugh at some of the antics of Rudy, who was kind of a rascal in many ways. Why don't you talk about Rudy?
Yeah, Rudy was a rascal. His army nickname was Punch Drunk. He tended to not follow the rules real closely and got into a lot of scrapes with people. But he had just an absolutely huge heart, and I think that really comes through in the book, and also in a clip we're going to see here in a minute. But Rudy grew up on a farm in Salinas, California, and his family was sent first to the Salinas Rodeo grounds, which was one of these so-called assembly centers. And then from there, they were sent to Poston, Arizona, to the very large concentration camp at Poston, a particularly hot, bleak, miserable place. And Rudy was one of the young men. When the 442nd was finally created, this all-Japanese American fighting unit was created in the spring of 1943. A lot of debate broke out in the camps among the young men as to whether they should volunteer to serve in the 442nd or not. Rudy was one of those who decided to serve, and so he enlisted, and he went off to war. And there's quite a war story that unfolds in his case.
Yeah, one of the things you did by selecting the Fort Bend was to tell a much bigger story, in that by choosing Gordon, you had the resistor and conscientious objector. With Katsumiho, the Japanese American experience in Hawaii. Rudy, you were able to look at the incarceration experience, being removed and volunteering, and then that conflict between the mainlanders and the Katonks and the Buddha heads, from Hawaii. Let's move on in terms of talking a little bit about some of the fighting that the 442nd went through, and in particular, you talk about this scene in the Vosges Mountains that was really this month of fighting, essentially, that was horrendous. And talk about that.
Yeah, so initially the 442nd served in Italy. They fought their way up the western side of Italy from basically Anzio up to the Arno River, a series of difficult battles for hilltop towns in Tuscany. But then they were sent north. They were sent to the French-German border, an area called the Vosges Mountains, the Vosges Forest. And by then it was November of 1944, and it was cold and muddy and sleety and dark and miserable fighting conditions. They were tasked originally with taking a town called Bruyères, which was the intersection of a railroad line and a couple of highways. So they fought tenaciously for days, and they did finally liberate the town of Bruyères to the great joy of the French civilians there. They moved on beyond that to a couple of towns, Belmont and Bifontaine, a little deeper in the Vosges forest. And then they were told they could take a rest and get a night or two of worth of sleep. But on the second night of the sleep, they were suddenly awakened and told they had to go back into combat. And what had happened was the commanding general, General Dahlquist, had ordered a unit of the Texas Division, 141st Infantry, too deep into the Vosges, and about 200 of them had been cut off and surrounded on a mountaintop in the Vosges forest. Dahlquist sent several of his Texas units, one after another, up that mountain to try to break through and get to these stranded Texans who were in desperate straits. Many of them were wounded. They had no food. They had no medical supplies. They had no drinkable water. They were beginning to die. None of these other units could get through to him. So finally, he sent the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, the all Japanese American unit, up the mountain to get to these Texans.
And I just want to mention, at this moment, I've talked to military historians. They'd say in the current army, the 442 would be considered maybe non-effective at this point. They had taken so many casualties. They had just been pulled from the line. And so in today's army, they wouldn't have been sent back out. And yet under those conditions, they were asked to do something or ordered to do something.
Their fighting capacity had been enormously degraded in the preceding week or so of fighting, taking Bruyères and these other towns. And they were also just bone weary, exhausted. And the weather just got even worse as they started up that mountain. So they fought in absolutely hellacious conditions for days to get up that mountain, oftentimes fighting up extremely steep mountainsides into the face of withering machine gun fire and even tanks firing point blank into their ranks, pointing downhill at them. And so they finally broke through and got to the Texans, and the Texans filed down off the mountain. But they were not relieved at that point. They were told to keep fighting their way deeper along this ridgeline and deeper into the Vosges. So for days more, they were still stuck up there fighting, and they continued to suffer casualties. By the time they finally came back down, K Company, which was the company that Rudy was in, and another one of the guys I write about, only 17 of them were able to walk back down off the mountain. After K Company was probably something like 180 people at the beginning of this sequence of battles. Only 17 of them were able to walk down under their own power after that battle.
Yeah, so after all that, General Dahlquist wanted what's called a retreat parade. He wanted the 442nd to assemble and march in front of him then, so he could acknowledge. And at this point, the men are, as you mentioned earlier, exhausted. They have given so much. Here Rudy's going to talk about that retreat parade because the men had given so much at this point. The 442nd at full strength, 4 battalions is about 4,000 men strong. On that day, there was less than 1,000 men left standing because they had taken such heavy casualties, the wounded, sick, killed. And here Rudy talks about that retreat parade with General Dahlquist.
The 36th Division commander wanted the 442nd to pass and review. And he said, all personnel of the 442nd will pass and review. So the 442nd passes and review, and like I say, you got 3 battalions plus headquarters, and they don't even have a battalion out there passing in review. So General Dahlquist turned around and he said to the colonel, when I order everyone to pass in review, I mean the cooks and everybody will pass in review. And Chaplain Yamada said, this is the first time I saw the colonel cry. And he said, this is all I have left.
Yeah, that clip always gets me, because I know how much they suffered, and through the stories what they were feeling, and then to have that happen was it's just so hard.
Yeah, I mean, I think that clip. I think I've told you before. I think that was the clip that sort of pushed me over the edge. I remember when I watched that, I showed it to my wife, and I was tearing up. She was tearing up, and it was one of the things that made me really, really want to write this book. Rudy had such a huge heart. He's just an amazing guy.
So let's go to the fourth man, and so we'll come back to Washington State. During the war, we know people, Japanese Americans who were removed from the West Coast and sent to the the concentration camps. But the state of Washington was divided between Western Washington and Eastern Washington. And so Western Washington, where most of the Japanese Americans lived, were incarcerated. But on Eastern Washington, they weren't. And so we go to the next person, we go to Fred Shiosaki, who lived in Spokane. So talk about Fred and why he was included.
Yeah, so Fred grew up in Spokane, actually grew up in a neighborhood called Hilliard, which was down by the railroad tracks. And it was a neighborhood that was full of immigrant families from all over the world. And I think partly because of that, a lot of ethnic slurs got tossed around among the kids in Hilliard. It was a pretty tough neighborhood. In fact, Fred was always coming home. His family ran a laundry, and they lived upstairs over the laundry. And Fred was always coming back home with his eyeglasses smashed because he'd gotten in another scrape. He was a kid that I think didn't particularly want to fight. He was really kind of a gentle guy in many ways, but he knew how to fight. At any rate, he was at home in the apartment over the laundry when news came on the radio about Pearl Harbor. And his family was absolutely shocked. And actually, Fred stayed home from school for the next couple of days. He was afraid to go back to school for fear of what might happen to him. But as his classmates began to enlist in the Army, Fred went down to the Selective Service office in Spokane and tried to sign up. And to his absolute shock, he was told that he couldn't sign up because he was classified as an enemy alien, even though he was, in fact, of course, an American citizen. And that just absolutely floored him. He didn't understand how he could be an American citizen and an enemy alien. So Fred finally did, when the 442nd was created, he was able to enlist. And as I say, he was in K Company and part of that group of 17 who managed to walk back down off the mountain after that rescue.
When I read the book, so Fred's, Fred was, I think he calls himself like a grunt. He was one of the infantry guys and fighting in the trenches, and so some of the most, for me, the most difficult and moving passages, came from Fred's story. It was so difficult sometimes to really learn about what they went through. We're going to show a clip of Fred, and it's it's after the war, and he's now returning to Spokane by train, and he's in the Washington, D.C. area. And he, at the train station, meets another soldier. So here Fred talks about that encounter.
I was on the train by myself, and we stopped in Washington, D.C. And I was actually, from that railroad station, you could see the Capitol building. I'm sure that must have been the Union Station. And I was sitting there looking out the window, and this GI came out, I think he's a buck sergeant, and he stopped and he looked at me and he looked at my patch. He says, "Hey, you were there for 42nd?" Yeah. He says, "Were you at the Lost Battalion?" And I said, "Yeah, I was there." He says, "I was in there."
So he was one of the 200 men that you rescued.
Yeah, anyway, it's one of those things. I could just feel myself getting I was angry, God, and I turned to him and I said, "Do you know how many men we lost getting you guys out of there? You know how many of my friends died in there?" And well, he said, "You know, if you guys were in there, we'd have come after you." And I shook my head and I said, "Well," he said, "anyway, I want to thank you." He put out his hand and I turned away and looked out the window.
Yeah, when I interviewed Fred about that, he goes on and he actually talks about how he wasn't really proud of that moment, that he wished he could have shaken the hand, but he was just so still angry. He was just so so much emotion, and I think he said in the interview that he was just irrational at that point.
Yeah, so a lot of these guys, I mean, the fact was, like other war vets, they came home with a lot of wounds, both physical wounds and mental wounds. Fred, I know, he moved for a while. He moved back into the apartment over the laundry in Spokane, living with his parents. And I know his mother had to awaken him in the night because he'd be screaming in the middle of the night. So he clearly had PTSD, as many of them did when they returned.
I want to remind the audience that we're going to be going now into the Q&A section, and we'll bring Paul back. But I have one more question for you, Dan, before we do that. So if you have a question, click on the Q&A and write your question in there. But we talked about us getting together 5.5 years ago, and it was a time of a lot of political and social turmoil and unrest. I remember early on, we talked about the Muslim travel ban that was going on, and how that rhymed in a sense. A group was being singled out for national security reasons. In a similar way, Japanese Americans were placed in camps with the rationale of military necessity. These were kind of injustices or untruths to incarcerate a lot of innocent people. We also had situations where we saw families being detained and separated on the southern border. More recently, we've seen the anti-Asian hate. And all these things, and as a historian looking at World War II, and as we saw these things unfold in recent years, how much they rhymed, how similar there were these things happening. And I want to ask you, how did that affect your writing of the book?
Yeah, it was very conspicuous to me as I started actually working on the book more or less the beginning of the Trump administration. So all of this stuff was happening, and there were so many echoes between what I was reading and researching about. When I was reading about these hardworking immigrant families coming from Japan, there was all this rhetoric about immigration. And as you say, when I was reading and talking to family members about their incarceration experience, there were kids being locked up on the southern border and families being torn apart. So there were, I'd be working during the day and then I'd listen to the news at night, and there were just these constant echoes going back and forth. And so, it certainly motivated me. It also, I learned, one of the reasons I write kinds of books I write is that I learn a lot by doing it. And so I personally learned a lot more about the history of anti-Asian prejudice in this country than I thought I knew a lot about it going in, but I learned that I didn't know as much as I thought. So, I was reading about, doing my due diligence and my research, I was reading about the Chinese American experience when Chinese immigrants came to California during the gold rush and to work on the railroads, and the kinds of vicious racist tropes and images and actual outright violence that they were met with. And then reading about the period or the era in which the press and Hollywood promulgated this notion of what they called the yellow peril, using imagery of insects and rats and locusts and plagues and associating Asian immigrants with disease. And those things became embedded in the American consciousness long before Pearl Harbor. They were already there.
Oh.
And so when Pearl Harbor happened, it was so easy for people to just sort of pull those up and weaponize them and hurl them against their Japanese American friends and neighbors and business associates, because they were pre-made, they were ready-made. And to me, what's been really interesting in the last few years, and especially just the last few months, is you see it again. You see those same associations being brought up again about Asians and weaponized and hurled at them. So it just, it taught me that this is something that is cyclical. It's been going on a long time, and it's been very eye-opening for me.
Wow, that's just so well said. I mean, just for me, just to hear you talk about that, really, that was very powerful. Thank you very much. So Paul, at this point, do you want to come back on screen and take it over?
Tom and Dan, thank you. What wonderful reflections and comments. And I just want to remind our audience that I'll start with a few questions, and you've got a Q&A box on your screen, and you're welcome and encouraged to raise your question in the Q&A box. So Dan, Tom, the first question I have is on this topic of patriotism. Certainly a word in these last years that remains controversial. And I'm struck with this relationship that the Japanese American community had to this idea of patriotism. In May of 1942, Gordon Hirabayashi, recognizing that he's going to be arrested, he writes a letter. And in his letter, it was titled, "Why I Refused to Register for Evacuation." And in his final paragraph, Gordon says these words. He says, "Let me add, however, that in refusing to register, I am well aware of the excellent qualities of the Army and government personnel connected with the prosecution of this exclusion order."
Yeah.
This tremendous dichotomy, this dynamic tension of respect and dignity and a definition of patriotism that seems unique today. Could you both speak about what you discovered around that dynamic tension?
Yeah, I mean, for me, it was remarkable to see the patriotism of these young Japanese American men who I say were all draft age. They expressed it in very different ways, but they were both very patriotic things. So when Gordon wrote out this principle outlining the constitutional reasons why a racially motivated curfew and a racially motivated rounding up and locking up of people was un-American and unconstitutional, that was deeply, deeply patriotic. And he subjected himself to a lot of ridicule from the public at large. He subjected himself to imprisonment. There was a lot of dissent and controversy within the Japanese American community that he had to deal with. So, but he did that because he was so patriotic. At the same time, other young men chose a very different path. Those who decided to enlist, for instance, somebody like Irudi Tokiwa, and literally lay his life down. And by the way, the 442nd suffered enormous casualties and was also a very, very highly decorated unit. So, a different, more sort of traditional display maybe of patriotism, but they were motivated by patriotism. And then I should mention there was a sort of third category here, the young men within the camps. There came a point at which they were all required to fill out a loyalty questionnaire. And a couple of the questions on that loyalty questionnaire, a lot of these young Japanese American men did not feel they should have to answer. One of them required them to forswear any allegiance they had to the Emperor of Japan. These were American kids. They didn't have any more allegiance to the Emperor of Japan than you or I do. So on principle, they refused to sign that form because other Americans weren't being required to. So then they came to be called the no-no boys. So I mean, I see all of these as different faces of patriotism, even though they are contradictory in some ways.
Yeah, and just I mean, Dan's answer was spot on, and there's just a couple of things I want to add to that, and one is how extraordinary Gordon Hirabayashi was. I mean, he was a young man. I believe he was about 20 years old, going to the University of Washington, and not only the passage you read, Paul, but if you read the letters and his writings when he was at the county jail, the King County Jail. I mean, there's just I mean, they reminded me like the letters from Birmingham in terms of some of his passages and his clarity in terms of what it meant to be an American. And it was not only his right, but his responsibility to speak up. And for such a young man to go against, not only, the general public, but in many cases, the community. The community didn't understand what Gordon was doing. So it was just so extraordinary. So there's that point I want to make. The other side, and this might be, maybe almost controversial in some ways. And when I think about this, when I think of the men in the 442, there were these values that not only were American, but also Japanese. Example is, as these men were leaving their families to go to war. Oftentimes, these men would have discussions with their parents, in particular their father. And the conversation oftentimes was the father telling their son, we realize this is going to be dangerous. You might lose your life. The big thing is don't bring shame to the family. In some ways, the message was it's better to die an honorable death on the battlefield than come back with shame. And to me, when I think of the spirit of Japanese sort of values of Bushido, things like that, that's even more Japanese than American in many ways, and that kind of distinguished the 442. So again, we talk about the 442nd as one of the most decorated units in U.S. military history, and the patriotism. What's interesting is sort of and I think about the values immigrants bring to the United States. It was interspersed with a lot of Japanese values, which was really, really important.
But that's I agree with that. And the thing is, those foreign virtues, those foreign attitudes, actually made them better U.S. soldiers, which sort of shows you that importing values from different cultures is part of what has made America as great as it is. And I think that's a beautiful example of that.
In your work with Densho and thinking of that patriotism topic, when the 442nd returned and through the years, did you see in the oral histories an evolution of their perspective of patriotism? Did they have an innocence lost in the sense that their reflection on what happened over time? Did you see a change in the years? Did these veterans express any transition in their thinking?
Yes. So I think Tom's probably better equipped than I am to address that. So I'll let him take that.
Well, I'll start, Dan, because you've thought about this too. I mean, first off, I should say, I've interviewed several dozen World War II vets, and in general, talking about what happened during World War II was very difficult, and most of them had a hard time sharing, and I think in many cases, the ones who didn't share, I think, in some ways may not, it's hard to know. But, I think there was for me, an interesting kind of shift and transformation in the 1980s. It had to do when the the community was going to the government, asking for an apology, reparations, and we call it the Redress Movement. And there were some veterans who took a real leadership role, and I saw a shift in their stories in terms of, I think early on, many of them said, you know what, we were just doing what we were supposed to do, doing what was sort of expected, doing things to make it easier for my community. During redress, what they recognized was what they had really done from a larger patriotic and their place to speak out in terms of what happened to the community. So I saw the veterans, in particular during redress, speaking out more in terms of what they did. Whereas before, I think they tended to be very humble and didn't share as much. And I think they realized if they spoke out and started talking about it, it made a difference. I mean, Dan talked about the Rescue the Lost Battalion, this Texan unit. When the redress bill passed, the one of the main sponsors was the Speaker of the House, Jim Wright, who was from Texas, and he knew the story of the Lost Battalion. And so, and it was veterans who went to him to tell him that story. So I think you did see this evolution.
I think I'd also point out that, in Hawaii, it was a little different than on the mainland. The Hawaii guys, as I said earlier, when they left Hawaii to enlist in the military, they came from the plantation system, basically. I mean, that was the culture in Hawaii, particularly for Japanese immigrants and their children. A lot of those guys came back, 442 vets came back to Hawaii, kind of determined to change Hawaii, to modernize it, and to, for one thing, bring statehood into being for Hawaii. So guys like Daniel Inoue and Katz Miho and Spark Matsunuga, a bunch of these veterans came back, and they immediately enrolled in the university, got their degrees either in Hawaii or on the mainland, and then went to law school. A lot of them went to George Washington for some reason. A lot of them were in the same class at George Washington in law school. And then they came back to the islands, and they became, lawyers and government officials and politicians. And they began over time to wield a lot of influence in Hawaii in both politics and business and governance. So they did play a huge role in sort of reshaping Hawaii.
Thinking of these returning vets, Carolyn Brenner has a question in the chat. So would the 442nd, would they hold reunions? Was this an active community after the war and through the decades?
From my perspective, they absolutely did. In fact, their children still hold reunions. I was privileged to go recently on a trip with some sons and daughters of doing a tour of some of the battlefields they fought on in Europe. So my perception is, as an outsider, my perception is that they've been very good about sticking together as a community and holding reunions. Again, I'm sure Tom can speak in more detail about that, though.
Oh, and I've attended some of these, and in fact, the interview with Irudi Tokiwa that we just saw, came from a reunion, I believe, in 1998 in Hawaii, and so it's a great opportunity to not only interview people and get to know them, but to see the camaraderie, them just sitting around and what they say, talking story, and it's interesting. And Dan kind of talks about this in the book, in terms of the cultural differences, in terms of the Hawaii guys speaking pidgin and the mainland guys, not. But in Hawaii, when I'd see the mainlanders go there and talking with the Hawaiians, they start talking pidgin too. It's just a amazing kind of experience. And I also want to mention, in terms of reunions and pilgrimages, the camp experience. Those Japanese Americans who were incarcerated, they also have held reunions and have also organized pilgrimages. So not only do they go back, but they bring their families and others, so that the incarceration is not forgotten.
Thinking of the families of this generation, both of you have talked about the children, and in In 2008, the University of Washington, Tom, you remember this because Densho was active in this. It was called the Long Journey Home. It was an opportunity for the university to bestow honorary degrees on those students who were incarcerated in the early 1940s, of course. And hundreds of families, children, grandchildren came to the university. Norman Mineta came from DC. It was a beautiful, beautiful ceremony. The children of these individuals were so dynamic, so vocal. The relationship between how they viewed their parents' experience, their role, that communication dynamic. Can you talk about just what you see in the second generation, those that came after, and how they told the story, their interests, their advocacy? We know that original generation may have been reluctant to talk, but what have you seen in the next generation?
So I'm going to speak very briefly, but this is definitely something Tom knows way better than I do. But again, from my perspective, as Tom pointed out, the Nisei often were reluctant to talk about both the camp experiences and their war experiences. But my sense, as I've gotten engaged more and more with the community, is that Sansei and subsequent generations, and Tom can answer this, but maybe even particularly this most current generation, the generation that equates with millennials now, is actually, I think, quite motivated to bring the story forward, and not just to bring it out, but to activate it. Actually, it's one of Densho's, I know, mottos and themes is to activate history, to take those stories and use them to the furtherance of social justice, because they all touch on social justice. So, that's my sort of snapshot view of it. And as they say, I think Tom knows this stuff very, very well.
I mean, it's an interesting question because it's changed in not just in terms of the outlook by generation. We talk about, the Issei generation are the Japanese immigrants. The Niseis is a generation that Dan wrote about. I'm the Sansei generation. A child of a Nisei, and then the millennial generation we call the Yonsei. And if kind of Japanese counting Ichi, Ni, San, Shi, I mean that's kind of how those generations were named. But a couple of things in terms of how the story, in terms of my generation, when you read the book, you understand why we in many ways want the story of what happened to Japanese Americans preserved. I mean, not only from a community memorying and honoring our elders, but the power of the story for all Americans to hear. I mean, the Dan talked about the xenophobia, the fear, the malicious words, the targeting, and how that led to policies. Even though we have laws, the Constitution, how those were all kind of walked over for Japanese Americans. That's the lesson. Those are the reasons why my generation wanted to keep this so we could remember. And Dan mentioned in terms of my children's generation, the millennials, I think they've been really strong in terms of not only is it preserving it, but we're preserving it to really promote equity and justice today. And Japanese Americans today may not be targeted. Some people didn't even realize what happened to the Japanese American community. But to keep that story alive and connect it to, as I mentioned earlier, what's happening to Muslims, the immigrants who are crossing the border, and other Asian immigrants, and so for the community to be out there, something we say a lot at Densho is, our role today is to be the allies with vulnerable communities, the allies that Japanese Americans didn't have during World War II, and that's something that as a community we say a lot about.
So Tom, maybe say more about this equity and inclusion focus of Densho. There's a significant conversation about educational curriculum around diversity and inclusion, and what are we teaching our children? What does this story and this book tell us about civics and civic education? What should we be thinking about as an educated community?
Well, and Dan said this at the very beginning, and what comes to my mind, and I'm an oral historian, so I'm about stories too, and when we talk about it, sometimes I think when we talk about this issue, we there are principles, but a lot of times we get into our heads too much. And I think why I was so interested and excited to work with Dan is his ability to humanize, stories and individuals and what they went through. And Dan did this with the book. I mean, you read the book, you understand who these individuals are and why they lived the lives they did in a way that they aren't viewed as this, other community that, should be treated differently. I mean, they're just in many cases, just these happy-go-lucky teenage American teenagers who are going about their lives in these extraordinary times, what they did. And so when we talk about equity, yes, we have to, keep doing this, but so much of it is I think getting to know each other in different ways than we have. And I think, that's what why I've been so excited about the book. And yes, I can go in terms of, the equity training and how we have to do this, but at some point, I think it's just talking to people and hearing their story, which is so powerful.
Dan, in The Boys in the Boat, and certainly in your latest book, the role of media, the way that you bring forward the primary sources, radio, newspapers. When we think about today's 24-hour cable news cycles, social media, the way that information and misinformation is so much part of our society, what reflections do we have around the sense of community and the role that media has in either bringing us closer together or moving us further apart? What did you see in Facing the Mountain around the role of primary sources at that time?
Yeah, I mean, that was very striking to me. And again, it sort of it was an echo with what I've been experiencing in our public life more recently. The media was very much weaponized in the immediate aftermath of Pearl Harbor. As I say, these old racist tropes and images and phrases from the Yellow Peril era were brought up, and major newspapers and Hollywood characterized Japanese in absolutely degrading and vicious terms, and did not really distinguish between Japanese Americans and the soldiers of the Imperial Army of Japan. So the propaganda that surrounded the war, there's always propaganda surrounding the war. But in the case of World War II and the Japanese Americans, outright racist imagery was a very conspicuous part of that, and a big part of the story I tell in the book. And again, as I say, that's been sort of one of the echoes between what I've been writing about and what I've been experiencing in our national life, because I think propaganda is very much at work in our current political environment, particularly large media empires that are able to slant their news coverage in ways that basically alienate different segments of America from other segments. It's the same thing happening on a sort of different scale, but it very much was at work during the World War II era.
We have a question from Chris Kimura, wondering, where are the stories of women? Where are the stories of women? Reflections on that.
So I'll reflect on that first. As I say, I tried very hard to incorporate women's stories into this book. I think by definition, when I decided to focus the book on young draft-aged men as the principal characters, I sort of that obviously created a gender exclusion there in terms of the principal characters. But it is really important to understanding the story, to understand the role that mothers and sisters and even some daughters played in this story. These were communities that were ripped apart. It was not just a story of young men. The story really is, in fact, about communities being torn apart. So I think that was very important. It's also, in terms of primary sources, though, I mean, to be frank about it, I think because of both gender and cultural roles in the 1940s, a lot of the women, Japanese American women, did not leave a lot behind in the way of, oral, well, they later left oral histories, but they didn't leave the same kind of contemporaneous documentation of what they were doing in their lives. So that was harder to find in terms of just doing sheer research. But now Tom has talked, of course, with many, many Japanese American women. And so that is one source that I was able to use to get that perspective, was the Densho archives.
Yeah, I mean, we really focused from an oral history standpoint in the last 25 years to interview and record the stories of women. So I think we have close to 500 in-depth oral histories. And so they're there as there are so many other stories. I mean, earlier this week, I did another book event where I moderated. You're looking at the Japanese American stories strictly from the voices of resistance from within the camp. And those stories are there too. It's all there to be discovered in many ways. And Dan, kind of again looked at all these things. I know there's an answer about the war in the Pacific, and Japanese Americans fought there, and he could have done this. I mean, we had this long conversation of this big story and all these different perspectives, and as a storyteller, he had to kind of narrow it in some ways just to get through it. And my hope is that there are going to be other great books and stories and ways to show all these different perspectives.
Speaking of the Pacific Theater, did you see in your research, and this is both Tom and Dan, the idea of the Pacific vets, those that were from the West Coast, those that went into the Pacific Theater? Did you have any connection with those stories or any opportunities in that area?
So this
Dan,
is,
maybe you?
Sure. So this is one of the areas that when I focused on the 442, I necessarily excluded some other really important parts of the overall story. One of those is the MIS, the Military Intelligence Service. A lot of, as they were recruited into the 442nd or into the service, some young men were, particularly if they had good Japanese language skills, I think there was aptitude tests, but also Japanese language skill tests. If they had really good Japanese language skills, and some of them did because they'd grown up in families where Japanese was spoken in the home, they were sort of diverted out of the 442nd into the Military Intelligence Service and given specialized training at Camp Savage in Minnesota. Those young men were sent into the Pacific Theater, and they were sent there for a couple different functions, partly to listen in on Japanese transmissions and to translate them and so forth. But others actually served on the ground in combat units in the Philippines and other places like that, in real jungle warfare, because they were able to interrogate Japanese prisoners of war because of their language skills. There was also the really interesting guy I wish I'd been able to write about, an Okinawan who, as US troops or the Allied troops took over Okinawa, he spoke Okinawan dialect of Japanese. He went into these caves that civilians, in many cases, hid in caves in Okinawa, absolutely terrified of the American soldiers, being told they would be raped and tortured. This young man spoke excellent Okinawan, went into these caves and talked a lot of these people out and saved their lives that way. So there's a really rich, interesting story to be told about them.
Tom, multiple degrees from the University of Washington. Dan, years ago, you were given a lifetime membership in the UWAA. Your Boys in the Boat story certainly has brought the University of Washington into the worldwide spotlight. Maybe both of you, the role of higher education today, what do we need to be doing differently? I see in the attendee list so many alums that I know so well. Tom, I think about the extraordinary work of Dr. Larry Matsuda, past president of the Alumni Association, very active in this environment as well. What would you say to the University of Washington?
Well, I think first of all, yeah, as you already do, celebrate, your alums like Gordon Hirabayashi. I think that's a really important thing, is to take alums like that and make their stories prominent and well known as, a face of the university's history. I am, Paul, I am a huge believer in higher education for all the world's ills, basically. And I advocate for it on all levels whenever I can. I think, I just think, for instance, Tom mentioned that the UW archives hold most of the Hirabayashi materials. There's still tons and tons to be explored there. And it's things like that. It's things like special collections that really, in the long run, in historical terms, make a difference, because it's going to allow other people, other writers long after me to come along and tell some of these stories. So I think archiving is a really important function of the university.
Yeah, and from my perspective, I think about, going back to this, issue of equity. I went to the University of Washington before they had an American Ethnic Studies program, before they had Asian American Studies, and to elevate the stories of people of color is I think really, really important. I mean, I grew up at a time when, and some of your alumni will maybe remember when, Ron Chu worked at the Daily, and because of his treatment there, he never was able to graduate on time. I mean, he actually, I think they gave him an honorary degree, or gave his degree decades later, because he took a stand in terms of how he was treated as at the Daily, and the fact that he wasn't an editor. I mean, there's all these things that we had to, in terms of education at the University of Washington. There are challenges. I mean, I think of Dan's title, "Facing the Mountain," and oftentimes there are so many incredible people with such great talents who struggled at places like the University of Washington, because the doors weren't as open as they could have been. And to do that more, I think you will tap into this incredible wealth of talent, knowledge, differences that would make this, the University of Washington, even stronger. So that's my thoughts.
Tom and Dan, both of you have done so much to open the doors and open the minds and the hearts of so many in our community. As I think of this conversation coming to a close, and just recognizing the extraordinary contributions you've made to our community. Tom, your work with Densho, your work in this community to bring these stories and oral histories alive to future generations. And Dan, of course, your outstanding work for many years and your latest effort, Facing the Mountain. On behalf of the university community and just a wonderful university bookstore, it is so great to have you both with us this evening. We're going to invite Grace to come back on and say a few closing remarks, but thank you both.
Thank you, Paul.
Thank you, Paul. Grace, I think you might.
Bye. Oh, it says I'm not on mute.
Now we have you.
So again, thank you, Paul, and a huge thank you to Dan, Tom, and Paul for stopping by and sharing these powerful stories with us. We'd love to host you all in person very soon as things open up again, so consider our doors always open to all of you. And a huge thank you to our audience today for spending time with us and a good book. We have signed copies available right now at University Bookstore of Facing the Mountain. If you missed any of this event will be soon available on the U Bookstore YouTube channel. Thank you for joining us tonight, and please check our website, social media, or sign up for our emails to hear more about other upcoming events. Have a great night, everyone.
Okay.